Okay, so today we're going downstream to a place where millions rely on a single river for, well, basically their survival.
Mm.
And we're going to talk about a dam. A dam.
Sweet.
A big one. A really big one.
Yeah, the biggest.
The biggest one, and the problems that it may or may not cause.
Right.
So to kind of set the scene for our listeners, imagine this. You're sitting there, you've got a cup of tea in your hand, maybe you're fishing on the banks of the Brahmaputra, just living your life.
Daily life, right?
Right, exactly. And then all of a sudden you hear this news that China's planning to build this absolutely monstrous hydropower dam way upstream in Tibet.
The Maydog Dam, yeah.
The Maydog Dam. And it's enough to make you set that tea down and think, was this going to change everything?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just the people living right there on the riverbanks. We're talking about potential impacts that could ripple all the way to Bangladesh, India, even further.
Right. It's international. It's a big deal.
Absolutely. It's a huge story, implications for millions upon millions of people.
And that's exactly why we're diving into this today. Right? We want to go beyond just the headlines.
Yeah, beyond just like China builds dam, right?
Exactly. We want to understand the why, how, the who's affected, and really get to the heart of what this dam could mean for people's lives.
Totally. And I think the best place to start is with the anxiety.
The anxiety.
Yeah, because there's a lot of it for good reason. Bangladesh, which is, heavily reliant on the Brahmaputra for so much.
Yeah, their lifeblood.
They actually formally requested information from China, environmental impact assessments, feasibility studies, projections, all that kind of stuff, just to understand what they might be facing.
Makes sense.
And guess what?
They said no.
Crickets, nothing, no response, which, when you're talking about a project of this magnitude, you'd think transparency would be key.
It's like your neighbor is building a giant addition and refusing to tell you if it's going to block your sunlight or not.
Exactly. It's that level of uncertainty. And when you're talking about something as essential as water, well, it's no wonder people are worried.
Especially when that water is essentially feeding your country. We're talking about a river that provides, like you said, over half of Bangladesh's irrigation. It's not a small thing.
It's massive. And this silence, this lack of information, it just breeds distrust. And that can escalate into bigger problems down the line.
Right. So we have this information vacuum. And then you layer on top of that the fact that we're not talking about some little stream here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about the Brahmaputra.
One of the major rivers of Asia.
The Yarlung Tsangpo in Tibet, the Jamuna in Bangladesh. It's got different names, but it's this huge artery flowing through multiple countries. And millions of people depend on it for everything.
For agriculture, for fishing, for their livelihoods, for their culture, even it's all tied to this river.
It's like that cool uncle who always shows up with the best gifts. Everyone benefits, everyone relies on him.
Yeah, and now imagine that uncle suddenly saying, well, I'm keeping all the gifts for myself from now on. That's kind of the feeling downstream.
Right. And speaking of keeping things, let's talk about the Maydog Dam itself and the scale of this thing, because the numbers are just mind-boggling.
They are prepared to be amazed.
$137 billion.
Whoa.
Approved in December of 2024.
So recent.
And it's slated to generate 60 gigawatts of electricity.
60 gigawatts.
That's 3 times the Three Gorges Dam.
Which was already the biggest.
Exactly. So you can see why China is so gung-ho about this, right? It's a huge energy win for them.
Absolutely.
But from the other side, you've got Bangladesh and India thinking, wait a minute, that's a lot of control over our water.
And not just the amount of water, but the timing, the flow rate, all of that could be impacted.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about some abstract fear here. Bangladesh's own environment ministry put out a report back in 2022.
I remember that one.
And they estimated that even a 5% drop in the Brahmaputra's flow during key times could lead to a 50% decrease in agricultural output.
Which translates to
food shortages,
saltwater and
people being forced to leave their homes. It's a domino effect.
And it highlights how interconnected everything is. Reduced flow doesn't just mean less water for crops. It means the balance between freshwater and saltwater gets messed up, and suddenly farmland is unusable.
And drinking water becomes scarce.
It's a whole ecosystem at risk.
And it's not just Bangladesh, right? India is staring down the barrel of this too.
Oh yeah, the Lowy Institute did some research on this, and the numbers are staggering. We could be talking about impacts on over 130 million people in India and millions of hectares of farmland, all because of this potential shift in how the Brahmaputra behaves.
Right, because they're worried about the same things: unpredictable floods during monsoon season, then severe droughts when the water is held back. And then there's the issue of sediment flow,
Ah, yes, the
which
segment.
most people think of as just dirt in the water.
Right, but it's so much more than that.
It's the nutrients. It's what keeps the soil fertile. It's what replenishes the land.
And a dam this size could trap a huge amount of that sediment upstream, essentially starving the downstream farmland.
So you get this gradual decline in soil quality, and eventually the land just can't produce like it used to.
It's like taking away the vitamins and minerals from a healthy diet. You know, things might look okay for a while, but eventually the consequences catch up.
And we haven't even touched on the impact on the ecosystem itself. I mean, the Brahmaputra is home to like 218 different species of fish.
It's incredible, the biodiversity.
And 2 million fishermen rely on those fish for their livelihood.
Absolutely. It's their life, their culture, their income, all tied to these fish, and a dam this big. Well, it could throw everything out of whack.
Because it changes the water temperature, the flow patterns, the migration routes of the fish. It's like messing with the delicate balance of a whole world.
Right, and these changes are often irreversible. You know, once you disrupt a river system to this extent, it's very hard to go back.
And then there's the elephant in the room,
The big one.
the earthquake risk.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about building the world's largest dam on the Tibetan Plateau, which is known for its seismic activity.
Not exactly the most stable ground.
It's like baking a cake during an earthquake. You know, what are the chances it's going to turn out okay?
And in this case, the cake is a massive amount of water held back by a huge concrete structure.
And if that cake collapses, well, the consequences downstream are unthinkable.
Unthinkable and potentially devastating for millions.
So it's understandable that India's been raising concerns.
Oh, yeah, they haven't been shy about it.
Back in January of 2025, India's Ministry of External Affairs, publicly voiced their worries about the dam and asserted their water rights.
Right. They've been trying to engage in dialogue with China about these projects for years, but it's a complex situation.
Because India's also been considering its own dams, right?
Yeah, like the Lower Shang Dam in Arunachal Pradesh.
Which is fascinating because it kind of highlights this internal struggle.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to control the water, but there are huge environmental and social costs involved.
Exactly, and those costs often fall on local communities who are directly impacted by these projects.
Right, and that's led to a lot of pushback and protests and delays with the Lower Sham Dam, which just shows how difficult it is to balance these competing interests.
It's a delicate dance between development and sustainability, and finding that sweet spot is never easy.
Now, to be fair, we do need to consider China's perspective on this, even if they haven't been super forthcoming with information.
Right, they've been pretty tight-lipped.
But they frame the Midog Dam as a key part of their green energy strategy. They've pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060, and they see hydropower as a big part of achieving that.
Which on the surface sounds good, right? Clean energy.
Absolutely. But the problem is the lack of communication and collaboration with the countries downstream.
It creates this feeling of being left out of the decision-making process, even though the consequences could be huge for them.
And that brings us to this idea of equitable water sharing, which has been a hot topic in international discussions.
It's a fundamental principle.
It basically means that everyone who relies on a shared water resource should have a say in how it's managed.
And that the benefits and risks should be distributed fairly.
Exactly. And in this case, there's a real sense that China is calling the shots without truly considering the needs of Bangladesh and India.
And that lack of equity can lead to resentment, distrust, and even conflict.
Especially in a region that's already dealing with a lot of geopolitical tension.
So it's a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And one possible solution that keeps getting tossed around is this idea of a trilateral agreement.
Between China, India, and Bangladesh.
Right, a kind of grand bargain where they all sit down and hammer out a plan for how to manage the Brahmaputra sustainably and fairly.
It sounds great in theory, right?
In theory, but in practice.
Well, it would require a level of trust and cooperation that's frankly hard to imagine right now.
Given the current political climate.
Exactly. But it's really the only long-term solution that could address everyone's needs and ensure the health of the river and the people who depend on it.
So going back to that image of sitting by the Brahmaputra with a cup of tea in your hand.
It's a lot less peaceful now, isn't it?
There's this underlying uncertainty, this sense of what's going to happen to my life, my livelihood, my community.
And it's a question that millions of people are asking.
And the answer, well, it depends on how this whole damn drama plays out.
It's a story that's still being written, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Because it's not just about water. It's about people's lives.
Their futures, their cultures, their very existence.
And the choices we make today will have repercussions for generations to come.
So we need to pay attention. We need to demand transparency, and we need to push for solutions that benefit everyone.
Because the Brahmaputra is a shared resource, and its fate is intertwined with the fate of millions.
And we can't afford to get this wrong.
Exactly. So let's keep watching the river and hoping for the best, but also preparing for the challenges ahead.
Because this story is far from over.
That's right. And it's a story that deserves our full attention.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's our deep dive into the Brahmaputra and the Mid-Oak Dam. Thanks for listening,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See you then.